Welcome back to the Brideson Show. Now, I've been having some really interesting conversations with my clients over the last few years about how do you prevent or minimize your risk of getting an injury. Now, the reality is there's no bulletproof way of minimizing any type of injury at all, but you've got to understand there's layers to it, and where you were 2 years ago could potentially be a very different spot to where you are now. Now, let's unpack that all a little bit. Now, as an example, say I have a brand new person to the gym. They've never weightlifted before. They haven't got a lot of stability or control. They're able to build strength and muscle mass quickly because they're sort of in that new and the beginning stages of their strength training journey. As they get a little bit further in, the areas of weakness that they had, such as, let's just say, the hips, your midsection, and your shoulders, those areas over time become strong points because they're areas that we focus on whilst we train. So as we get better and better at the thing that we do, whether it's building strength, building muscle mass, improving on range of movement and control, we also need to start to think about offsetting that training load that we do. So what I want to do is just kind of run through the conversations that I have with some of my clients to sort of unpack it a little bit, because I think it's something that needs to be discussed. And, I think recovery is a really big thing that's going on and people are discussing a lot more in the industry at the moment. But sometimes the simplest thing is actually looking at how you move as a human, looking at what's required for you for your sport, for the gym-based activity, and then reverse engineering it. So let's say, for instance, we get someone that comes in and they are looking to really dial in on the squat, bench, and deadlift. Let's look at the squat and the deadlift. Now, for instance, you're going to really utilize your hips, your glutes, your hamstrings, your quads. Now, all of your exercises are going to be working towards bringing up the muscle mass, bringing up your ability to produce force. Now, let's say, for instance, over time, my hamstrings and my glutes get really, really tight. And now I'm restricted into bringing my knee up towards my chest. The restriction in that movement is then going to have a whole host of issues associated with it. I may just run out of room and I can't perform certain activities because my range is reduced. It may push further upstream where I end up having back pain because I'm now lacking range of movement at the hip. And then I have a back issue where it's really not a back issue, it's a hip issue. Or I may end up running out of room at the hip, which then I end up with a hip impingement. So you can kind of see how it's, the thing that makes you strong essentially over time can actually be the thing that hurts you long term. So the conversation that I keep coming back to with clients is, if you are doing certain movements over and over and over again, you need to also be offsetting those particular movements. So if we look at the hip, for instance, and we look at the training load that goes through it, at some point in time, you're going to have to restore hip flexion, hip internal rotation to allow you to continue to progress. If we look at the shoulder, for instance, a lot of what we do in the gym is focusing on lat strength, back strength. And over time, we actually become quite limited into an overhead position. Now, when you move your hand into an overhead position, you also have a certain element of external rotation with it. So if we look at powerlifting as a whole, or if we look at bench press and we look at any of the upper body pressing movements in the horizontal plane, we need shoulder external rotation to get into it. So on one side, you need the muscles that strengthen it up to actually create the power, to create the control and stability, but we also need them to have enough length and range of movement to actually allow you to continue to do the thing that you want to do. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So it's if you think about it like this, like you've got a pyramid. So you come in and say you're someone that's hypermobile, for instance, and you have a ton of movement. And you come into training and, for instance, you essentially want to pull that system in. You want to make it tighter. You want to make it more stable and give that person help them develop their own understanding of where they are in space. Once they understand it, they're just going to excel at that because they're going to feel so much better. Like the niggles that they've had are going to clear up. The pain that they've potentially had from moving too much is going to clear up. But at some point in that particular journey, that's going to slow down and they might end up being in pain again. They're like, how am I in this situation again? But it's flipped, it's changed. The whole situation for them has changed because they've gotten better at the thing they originally came in to do. So that's a really good problem to have, but it's something that I think needs to be at the forefront of the mind. Now, if someone comes in from, never doing powerlifting before, for instance, and they've come in and now they're really dialed in, they've gotten really strong in the squat and the deadlift, for instance, they're now lifting so much more weight and pushing so much more tonnage through their body every single week. So it's like, at some point in the training process, you need to offset that. So you've got this pyramid of where you come in, and then you have this peak where you're no longer in this period where it's kind of like newbie gains. And then you need to start to do something to offset the particular training that you do to allow you to keep doing it. So the thing that often makes you strong ends up long-term actually being the thing that hurts you if you don't offset it. That's crazy to think about it, but it's one of those things that, when I'm having these discussions with people, there's no perfect answer for it. It's like, there's no particular drill that's gonna, allow you to train pain-free for the rest of the life and continue to make progress. It's just not that. You have to look at it from a bigger picture and go, okay, well, I'm putting so much load, so much tonnage, so much weight through a particular area. I also need to give it back a little bit and give it back a little bit of range, give it back a little bit of TLC just to allow you to continue to do the thing that you want to do. Now, you do get, groups of people that sort of don't like stretching or they don't like mobility. But the reality is we can't just continue to work without restoring any of the normal movement that we do. It's like driving a car and driving it with no oil. At some point, the car's going to stop working. So, some of the simplest forms of recovery are literally restoring range of movement. Now, it doesn't have to be in the form of stretching, for instance. It literally can just be getting onto a trigger point ball, getting onto a spiky roller, and working through these areas that are continually working for us. Now, think about it like this, right? So, when we are, say training for some hypertrophy, a lot of the time in hypertrophy, what we're trying to do is push blood to an area. We're trying to contract something over and over and over again. And yes, we are taking it through ranges of movement. So through those movement patterns, we are stretching it out and we're taking it through a full range of movement, which somewhat classifies as mobility. But the reality is we're continuously tightening things up over and over and over again. So if we look at it and go, okay, well, we've just upregulated all of these parts of the body over and over and over again, shouldn't we have some part of the training that downregulates it as well? So the benefit of having some of these recovery strategies in your actual training means that you can actually continue to train for a longer period of time. And, these are the conversations I'm having with my clients all the time, because the reality is I want people to train. I never want to have to restrict anyone from actually being on the gym floor, but we also need to appreciate that you get better at what you do over time. So the strategy also needs to change. Quite often you hear of people sort of like, say for instance, functional fitness and functional training. You hear of someone, they go, hey, I started at X gym and I was making killer progress, absolutely killer. I was PBing every week. I was adding weight to the bar. I was doing more reps. I was putting on, the muscle mass that I wanted to put on. And then all of a sudden you get one injury. That injury is then a catalyst for another 10. But the reality is what's happened is you've just gotten really good at a certain thing, but you haven't offset that load ever. So it doesn't mean that you need to spend 3, 4, 5, 6 hours a week on, doing trigger point stuff, doing, any sort of mobility or stretching. But at some point during your training week, there needs to be something that's in there for restoration, not just restoration of like the system, like your whole system, not like, sauning and ice baths and stuff like that. Actual restoration and recovery for the actual movement itself. That's where mobility comes into it. That's where movement comes into it. And I think often it's an overlooked area of training that actually is an area that's going to allow you to progress over time. Now, say for instance, you are doing a powerlifting prep and, you come into a session and you're really tight. You can feel that resistance and that stiffness getting in and out of the hole of a squat, for instance, and you spend 5 minutes doing some mobility. All of a sudden, there's no resistance there. You're not fighting yourself anymore. And now you have the ability to get in and out of that hole and actually just focus on the movement itself rather than opposing the tension that's in your system. Now, I'm not saying you have to go into every training session and do mobility and, spend all this time static stretching, but throughout your training week, there needs to be something that's going to allow you to increase that range of movement so you can continue to make progress over time. So that is probably one of the most common conversations that I have with clients when I'm treating them. And I always try and paint this picture for them of like where you started versus where you are now and kind of where you want to go. And that the strategy changes over time. There's no one strategy, but the strategy has to be adaptive to how good you get. And obviously the idea of training is to get better. So as you get better, you also then need to have better systems and better recovery strategies inbuilt into your training to allow you to progress over time. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword where it's like, I'm doing all this work, but now I need to do a little bit more. But that's a good thing because that means that you're making progress, you're building that tissue tension, you're building strength in certain areas. So the strategy over time definitely needs to change. But the reality is, if you're having to change your strategy, it's because you're progressing. So it's just a way of looking at it. And, if you have had an injury or you have had a setback in your training and you know that you train well, you know that you train with a good progressive and structured training program, but you have hit a few road bumps as you go, it probably just means that you need to shake up your strategy around your restoration and how you manage your actual body from just a base standpoint. Now, that's it for today. See you in the next episode.